So if you look into the New Testament and you look at this, especially in the study Bible, you see that the words that John the Baptist said, a voice of one crying out in the desert, make straight the way of the Lord. And he says right there that he's repeating what the prophet Isaiah said. Now, what's really important is that in the old, and when you're doing translations, especially of the scriptures, there were no punctuations, and so when you translate, you also interpret. That's why we have many different translations, and there's no one single translation. The one that's really only significant is the original language, the original text. After that, everything's kind of an interpretation, because in this text in particular, it's where you put the comma that becomes important. So it's a voice of one crying out in the desert, comma, make straight the way of the Lord. That's the way the New Testament interprets this, because it's a voice crying out in the desert, because John the Baptist was out in the desert, and he's crying out in the desert, make straight the way of the Lord. However, in the Old Testament, right, in the translation, the comma is often put, a voice of one crying out, comma, in the desert, make the way of the Lord. So you notice where you put the comma, it's like, is it the crying out, is it John the Baptist that's in the desert crying out? Or is it the taking of the idea that, make the voice of one crying out, like, go out to the desert and make the way of the Lord? So is it a command to go out to the desert? And when we talk about desert, very symbolic, the desert of one's life, the arid, the sort of where you've sort of stripped yourself of all of the things of this world. Oops, knock the little birdies off here. Knock the things off of the world. Strip your things off of this life. Go into the desert of our souls, the desert of our lives, the desert, and then make straight there the way. Or you go out to the physical desert, leave the things of this world, and make straight the way of the Lord. Just a little theology, just a little kind of biblical kind of translation and theology, how they study that. And you know what? The church holds them both. It recognizes that. Depends on where you put the comma. But there's one thing that's going to be, no matter where the comma goes, it is the command, really, in the end, to make straight the way. That's the point, right? To make straight the way. In other words, there's something that we have to do, whether it's go out to the desert, simplify our lives, remove ourselves from all of this, the stuff that the world kind of often traps us up into, in order to prepare ourselves to receive Christ. Right? I mean, that's it. I think that in the end, that's going to be the command, is that there's a preparation. There's something that we must do. And as I was reflecting on this morning, that it is tied. Our ability to find the Lord and to make straight the way for the Lord is tied up in the way we live our lives. In what we read, and what we form ourselves with, and what we take in through our eyes, what we take in through our ears, how much we educate ourselves to understand the questions that rise up in our hearts. That all too often, we treat it as if it's like a faucet, that, when I need it, I'll go over there and I'll turn it on and I'll get the water. So if I need faith, I'll go over there, turn it on, and I'll get faith. And it doesn't work that way. You have to, the sense of going out into the desert, it does depend upon the way we live our lives. And I was trying to kind of come up with a concrete example. That's what I always do, right? So I'm trying to kind of say, okay, how do I relate this to some example in my life? And I end up thinking about living a healthy life, of course, because that's what I'm trying to do, and a thing like exercise. And we all know that healthy living takes the time of preparation in our life. What we eat, how we exercise, that it does affect how our ability to live this life in a better way. And I'm convinced of that, where we get more sleep, if we're filled with anxiety, our overall health, the ability to move, to pick up things, to go up and down stairs, our ability to live a better life comes from the choices we make before that. They're not isolated, right? It's not just isolated. And so I know, recognizing that is that in order to be able to do the things, let's say, that you want to do, go up the stairs, walk down the street, go up a hill, whatever, that you have to prepare for those things. And the way you prepare for them is by the way you live your life. It's not like all of a sudden you could just say, okay, I'm going to be able to do that. And so many other things are that way. And I think sometimes a lot of us, and maybe even in our relationship with our young people, is that they just sort of say, based on the way they live their life, whether they find God, whether they believe in God, whether they do the right thing or not. And it's like, oh, no. First, you live a virtuous life. You live a holy life. And then you see the truth of it. The truth comes from preparing oneself to receive the truth, to make straight the way that it is not, a thing that you could just sort of turn on that all of a sudden I'll be able to see it. But there is a preparation that must happen. And the desert is often a symbol of that kind of stripping the things away of this life, that we get kind of, wrapped up in. To be able to hear, to be able to see, to be able to understand, And so may we recognize that, because obviously we're in the very beginning, so Christ is going to come on the scene and we get into ordinary time and then start his preaching. But what's for sure is that you can't see the truth of the preaching just by listening to it only. Some of it is based on how one sees the world and one lives his or her life.